So hi everyone, welcome to Organ Technology number 22, and today we're going to take a look at a Rodgers Model 22. And no, I didn't plan it that way, it just was happenstance and it worked out, and I thought, well, let's go with it. So it's really, really, really hot today here in my hometown of Fresno, California. You know, we're in the Central Valley, and it can be very, very hot in the summer, and it can also get a little on the muggy side, and that's what today is. Our evaporative cooler is running as hard as it can, and you might be able to hear the whir of fans in the background. And you'll notice I'm wearing just a plain white t-shirt because it's too hot to put anything else on. So where did this Model 22 come from? So in the town kind of east of Fresno, out on Shaw Avenue, there's a little fruit packing town called Biola. And right in the center of town is the Biola Congregational Church, and it is just like your classic Old West town. The church is in the center of town, and the church spire is the tallest thing in town. In this case, other than, you know, the old style water tower. And they had a Rodgers Model 22 that they bought new, probably around 1969, maybe 1970. I was asked to come out and take a look at it, and the power supply is completely gone. And we're not certain as to whether or not that did any damage further upstream to the electronics. Going through and fixing the power supply would not be that big a deal. I'd probably have to do all the things I did on the 33E's power supply, but it would work out to some time and a little bit of money for the church. And it turns out that somebody had donated an organ to them. Now, I'm usually a little skeptical of this, because generally when people say, oh, I have an organ, I'll gladly give the church. It's usually one of these, you know, like a little Lowry genie, spin it with the one-finger chords and things like that. Completely useless in a church. And, you know, you don't want to be mean to people and saying, hey, this thing's no good to us. You want to be nice about it. In this case, they were donating a much newer Rodgers Model 650. And they showed me the pictures, and I, you know, just looking at the pictures and how beautiful it was an organist's practice organ in their home its entire life. So I said, you know, this thing's probably in great shape. Get it down here, we'll get the 22 out, and we'll just go from there. So let's talk a little bit about the Model 22. This is a Model 22B in particular. Here's what she kind of looks like face on. Pretty typical Rodgers 2-manual organ with stop keys. Now, the 22 is in 6 different versions and was in production from the beginning of the 1960s to 1971. So it was one of among the first production instruments that Rodgers made. I'm showing you pictures of the various brochures that went with these instruments. As far as when they started production, on the Rodgers technical site, there's no firm date as to when the Model 22 went into production, but looking over schematics and service manuals, I found numbers on the drawings dating clear back to 1960. In all likelihood, the Model 22 went into production in 1961 and was built until 1971 in 6 different versions. The Model B and the Model D were in production clear through from 1966 to 1971. The Model D is the one that has the moving draw knobs. It was kind of the deluxe version of this instrument. Now, if we start to look inside the Model 22, we're going to find that it's exactly the same technology as the 33E theater organ here in the studio. And if you want to know more about that technology platform, you can look over those 33E videos where I go into a little more depth. You can look at the technological development of Rodgers in their analog days basically in three chunks. There's the 1960s, there's the 1970s, and there's the 1980s. Now, through each decade, there are refinements that are made and improvements that are made, but pretty much the major basis of the technology that they're using is decade by decade. And of course, there's inevitably, because you're producing a lot of different models, there's overlap. The 1970s organs, as it were probably in production before all of the 1960s organs went out of production. And so you'd have two different technological systems. Now, if we want to look at this very basically, in the 60s, you had negative keyed systems. The keyboards were using negative voltage to trigger negative keyed relay switches and stop switches that create a gate for oscillators that are on. And then if we go to the 70s, we see a further refinement of the keying circuits, and we kind of get away from oscillators that are arranged as a unit voice, such as the unit tibia in the 33E and what we'll see in the 22B, a unit flute. And then if we get into the 80s, that's where we get into the McCasco era, and we still have analog technology being used for making the sound, but we have introduced digital technology in the form of microprocessor control to really manipulate those sounds a little more thoroughly to get a much more refined, finished product. Then, of course, in the 90s, we see the complete switch over to digital, and that's a whole other world. So my history with this particular Model 22 is that in the early 70s, when I was learning to play the organ, I started, was very anxious to get out there and make some money as an organist. And some of my family were parishioners at the Biola Congregational Church. And from time to time, they needed a substitute organist. And so the very first organ I ever played professionally was this particular Rodgers Model 22B. I also played my cousin's wedding on that 22B many, many years later, and now I'm helping to replace it with a newer instrument. So let's take a quick look inside of this Model 22B. If we look at the first rack, the primary thing we see are the main oscillators and all of the filter circuits. Now, just like the 33E, the main oscillators are always on, and then there's a series of keying circuits that work like a gate. So when I'm playing the notes on the keyboard, all of the gate circuits are sending the appropriate tones through over to the filters. And if we look a little closer at some of the filter stuff, you'll see those same gray reed relays that were used to switch the audio signal from the keying circuit output going into the filter circuit that would shape it into diapason, string, trumpet, oboe, whatever. And of course, you had to have a separate one of those switches not only for each of the voices, but also for each of the pitches that that voice was going to speak at. For example, the diapason speaks at 16, 8, 4, 2, and mixture on this organ, and so you have to have keying circuits for all those pitches, and then you have to have a reed relay to turn on and off the signal going into the filter that develops that particular tone. Now, if we look at the second rack, we have, again, just like the 33E, we have a unit flute. Well, a unit tibia would be very similar, it's just voiced a little different. But our unit flute is there, and we also have now, I'll be on the next rack, but we see in a unit configuration that the oscillators are keyed the same way that organ pipes are keyed. So what happens in this case is I'm playing the keys, and the keying voltage goes over to a series of stop switches, which, just like they would on an electric action pipe organ, those stop switches are located on the next rack. But what happens is, just like in a pipe organ, the keying voltage is routed to the appropriate oscillators at the appropriate pitch, depending on which switches I have selected. In this case, the unit flute speaks at 16/8, 4, 2 2/3, 2 foot, 1 3/5, and 1 foot. So you have all of those switches, and then those are time shared between the swell, the grate, and the pedal. So if we open up next to the third rack, here we have the Celeste oscillators. And again, just like the 33E, the Celeste oscillators are keyed the same way as the unit flute, just like a unit rank on a pipe organ. We also have on this rack the keyers and switches for sending the keying signals and oscillator signals over to the other racks in the instrument. So now that brings us to the next question. What is going to happen to this old 22B? Well, if I were of the mind to completely restore my 33E to like new condition, I would definitely pull the racks out of this 22B and bring them home in order to have spare parts and components and things that I could put onto the 33E. I talked in some of the 33E videos about adding an oboe filter to the circuitry so I could have an oboe stop, which would be a really nice addition to the 33E's rank lineup. Well, there's an oboe filter on the 22, so that would work because it's negative keying. But here's the thing. The other thing that is influencing my decision here is I really looked at my studio, and I've gotten a little gung-ho with collecting old organs. I had that really big Johannes 4 manual that started giving me trouble. I had the 33E, which I was doing work on, trying to get it to play and just have some fun with it. Had my Hammond Model A. I had another Hammond. I've got the mixture Hopwerk instrument over here. I've got another instrument in the garage. I got an instrument in a warehouse. I've got my live performance rig for my original ambient music, and it was just too much. I wasn't enjoying anything, and you'll notice that I've really had a hard time getting these technology videos out because I simply can't get around and work on stuff. So I made the decision that I was going to go all out with Hopwerk. I'm already using the Hopwerk software on my live performance rig, and there's no reason why I can't use that same little laptop with the Hopwerk software on it to be a theater organ or a classical organ. Furthermore, Hopwerk doesn't care if I'm playing theater organ music on a classical console or if I'm playing classical music on a theater organ console. And the bottom line is, the console that makes me the happiest to sit at and make music from is the theater organ console. So I have decided at this point I'm getting rid of pretty much all the other stuff in the studio. I'm going to convert the 33E to be a Hopwerk controller, and I'm going to get me a nice theater organ sample set, a nice classical organ sample set, and they'll both play from that console. Plus, that gives me the ability to, open up that space and bring in some other memorabilia that I want to enjoy, put some chairs down once in a while when friends want to come over and hear me play some music, make it nice. And so that's what's going on. Now, what's going to happen next on our organ technology videos? Well, I got my hands on another theater organ, the deluxe Model 340 that Rodgers made in the 70s. That was the very first theater organ, or first Rodgers organ I ever played, and fell in love with and wanted. But it was tens of thousands of dollars back in the 70s, and my parents had just bought their house for $8,000, and so they certainly weren't going to spend many times that for me to have an organ. So I never did have a 340, but I have one now. Any rate, it's too big to bring into my studio, but I am fixing that up. So I want to show you this one picture quickly, just because it shows something very interesting. If you go back to the beginning of the 33E videos, we had problems with the power supply, and I had to go through the power supply and put new capacitors in and replace some other components, and then things started working much better. On the 340, we've turned it on, gone through it. Everything seems to work. We have a few kind of weird intermittent things, and there's one dead note on the Canura. And if we take a look at this power supply, you can see that at some time or another, those rectifier diodes right at the top had the magic smoke let out of them big time. You can see that burn mark there. I don't know if these diodes were replaced or not. Generally, if something like this happens and you put in new diodes, you clean that off so that the next guy coming along, like me, will be able to say, oh yeah, that looks good. Now I don't know. And here's the thing, that's a full wave 4-diode rectifier, and there's lots and lots and lots of filtering and regulation on the power supply downstream. It's very possible that one of those diodes is still conducting electricity, but it's not directing the flow of that electricity. That's a condition that, maybe could slip by and things would work okay. But we're going to put new diodes in this power supply. There's a couple of different rectifier circuits. We're going to put mostly all new capacitors on this. Now, my first plan for this 340 was to do what I'm going to do with the 33E. Gut the thing out, turn it into a Hopver controller. But when I put that idea online on some of the Facebook pages that deal with organ stuff, a lot of people said, no, I want a 340. And so looking at the fact that it really just needs a minor rebuild on the power supply, and then we got to go through and clean things up and make sure everything works, I'm just going to fix it up. We'll offer it as is, and if somebody buys it as is, that's fine. So next video will be our first look at this beautiful glossy black Model 340. So thanks a lot for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our little look at a very old Rodgers organ. And next time we'll look at the 340 and have some fun with that. We'll see you next time. Take care.